So this is going to be a weird video, maybe a bit of a fun video, but we're going to go through pretty much every book I've ever read, or at least the ones I'd actually recommend. So I've got my list here, and we're going to try to do a bit of an unedited video here, but we've got a list of about 79 books, which is an annoying number because if it was 4 less that would have been nice, if it was 20 more or whatever that would have been nice as well, but no. 79 is what we've come to. And it's a mixture of books. So we're going to start off by going over some self-improvement or philosophy books, because I think that's what a lot of people are here for on the YouTube sphere, is the self-improvement side of things. But then we're going to go on to arguably what I think is more important, and that's fiction books. And then we're going to talk about 2 literary phases that I had during my life. And that was when I discovered Murakami, who was a Japanese writer, and then the Beat Generation, who were a set of authors who were writing in around the 1950s in America. But anyway, quickly, little water break because it's 37 degrees today. Which for a lot of people who are watching this from the UK or America won't really get that. But yeah, I'm in Australia at the moment, and yeah, it's fucking horrible. So I'm drinking water, I'm staying hydrated, boys. But anyway, let's start off the list. And the first 2 books in the self-improvement philosophy section are The Antichrist, The Twilight of the Idols, which are kind of like a combo. They came as a joint package sort of book. And Thus Spake Zarathustra. And these are all books by Friedrich Nietzsche, who was, I think, a German philosopher in about maybe the 1820s, who wrote about different things. And The Antichrist and The Twilight of the Idols are kind of interesting books, but I think Thus Spoke Zarathustra is a more important book. And like I said, we're not going to speak about everyone in very much detail, but we're going to go over a few of them in detail. And Thus Spoke Zarathustra was a very interesting book for me. It's basically a book where he recounts in quite a poetic style the coming down from heaven of this new prophet, Zarathustra, who comes with the message that God is dead. And that means different things. A lot of people hear that quote and they think it's about Nietzsche saying that basically God doesn't exist. But it's a book about reevaluating values. It talks about this ideal of, kind of along with the Antichrist, they speak, both of them, about this idea of how Christianity and religion generally, and we can kind of move that into the modern age by saying capitalism, for example, consumerism, how that's shaped humanity, how it shaped society, and how we should fight back against that and create our own values. So it has these ideas of the metamorphoses, and we made a video on that a while ago, but it has the idea that you should become the camel to begin with, the person who's laden with the burdens of society, move on to the lion who starts creating his own values, and then finally the child who can kind of create new things after having destroyed the values of old. But anyway, it's a great book to read. It's quite a complex book. It's quite poetic. So it's difficult, but also if you can read kind of a summary maybe and then go on and read the actual book, you might get a bit more of an understanding of it. At least that's how I did it, and that's how I found it most easy to read. Next though, on the other side of kind of like the easiness of entry into philosophy, we have The Outsider by Albert Camus. And this honestly is one of the greatest books I've ever read. And it's a weird one. So it's written in a very sort of fictional way, and to not spoil anything, it's basically about a guy's kind of internal monologue and internal struggle. But if you know anything about Albert Camus, his big philosophy of life was something called absurdism. So at the time he took various different philosophies like nihilism, which would teach that the world had no meaning, and so what was the point in living? And he took that and he basically said, well, the point of living is enjoyment. It's kind of whatever you make it. He had this idea, this essay that he wrote called The Myth of Sisyphus, and it was about this ancient Greek king who'd been cursed in hell to constantly push this rock up to the top of the hill, and then it would fall back down again right as he got there. And Camus said that's kind of similar to our lives. We do this task, this momentous task, every single day, but we don't know exactly why we're doing it. We do this thing and then the rock falls back down the hill, metaphorically. And he says, well, why don't we kind of have some fun with it? How about you push the rock up backwards, or run up the hill, or fucking, I don't know, just do all this random shit, race the rock back down the hill. How about you try and add some spice into your life? And that's what Camus said. Then next, number 4, we have Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I can't remember who that was by. I think Robert Pingin, kind of sounds a bit familiar. But it was a book, a bit of a weird one. We're not going to speak too much about this one, but it was 2 guys, a son and a father, who travelled across America, and they kind of speak about philosophies, about ideas of subjectivity and objectivity and beauty and just generally all that fun stuff. Next though, number 5 is The Little Prince by Antoine Saint-Exupéry, French guy. Weird book. A weird book to recommend because people understand it strangely. So On its surface, it's a children's book. It's illustrated. It's about 50, 60 pages long, I think. It tells a very simple story about a little prince who's this kind of alien from an asteroid who meets up with this pilot and tells him a story of how he's travelled through the world and seen all these different random things. But the depth of it is actually a very profound and beautiful book about the simplicity of childhood, about growing up, about maturity and losing that sense of innocent curiosity. It's a book about the meaning of life and about existentialism and this boy who travels to these different planets, and he's so confused by the adults that he sees, even though they live lives so familiar to us. He goes and meets a king who counts the stars and says that they're his kingdom even though he's never been to them. He meets a man who drinks to forget the fact that he's an alcoholic. He meets a man who lights a lamp every single night just to put it out again in the morning, but no one's actually there. It's a book essentially about the human condition. A very simple book to read, but a very beautiful and poignant one nonetheless. And then next, number 6, is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And Hesse was a great author, a German author, and we've got a few books by Hesse on this list, but Siddhartha was fantastic. It was basically a retelling, not really a modernised retelling, but just a retelling of the myth of Siddhartha Gautama, who was the Buddha. Well, I'm sure you knew that. But yeah, so it's a retelling of that myth, the story of him moving out into the world from his palace, seeing the 3 sights and whatever, the 4 noble truths, all these different things. But it's a great way of kind of understanding and coming to terms with Buddhism in quite an approachable way. It's a great book to read. Then next, in a similar vein to sort of Buddhism, so these now we're going to start covering the Buddhist phase of my life, which is when I literally would fucking rock about wearing my poncho, carrying my stick with a little leather cowboy hat on. I went full Buddhist for a bit. I would meditate for 3 or 4 hours a day. And the book that really got me into it was The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. It's going to have a little water break. And that book, it was kind of in a way an oversimplification of Buddhism, but it spoke to me about it speaks about the inner voice that people have inside of our heads, that thing that gives you negative thought spirals, that's constantly thinking of things. And it rationalizes it and it paints it in a way that's quite relatable. And for the first time ever, you sit there and you think, wait a minute, yeah, that's kind of true, what the fuck? And it teaches you that essentially you're not that voice, that your emotions are separate to you, and how to build that separation. Essentially it teaches you why you should meditate on quite a spiritual level. I mean, of course, we've done videos on why you should meditate in quite a practical, scientific way, but this speaks about the more spiritual side to it, the quieting down to that inner voice. And then next is The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama. And again, it's a book about compassion, meditation, teachings. We're not really going to go over these books too much. They're all fairly similar in themes, but this is a book about compassion. It's about the kind of, I've forgotten, the Tibetan Buddhism, there you go, less Zen. Then next is The Gateless Gate, which is more Zen, so you can see how I progressed throughout the different forms of Buddhism, and essentially I landed on Zen meditation. And The Gateless Gate is essentially a book of different Zen meditations that you can do, so if you're interested in that, go and look at it. Or then next was The 3 Pillars of Zen. Again, I don't know who these were by, but they're very easy to find. The 3 Pillars of Zen. It was about a professor who went to India, or maybe China actually, and studied the Buddhist monks. And he wrote about how they meditate in quite a practical way. Then next was The Diamond and the Heart Sutra. And a sutra inside of Buddhism is like a teaching that the Buddha gave. It's a speech that he gives to his disciples and his followers. And these are 2 of the most famous sutras. And if you're getting into Zen meditation, they're crucial ones to read. Anyway, next we move on to a different kind of spiritual phase in my life, which was Stoicism. And we've got 2 books here. The first one was The Guide to the Good Life by Irvine. That's book number 12. And it was quite a practical and actionable way of laying out Stoicism. It was my first encounter into what a philosophy of life could be. And it teaches you in very practical terms kind of what to do. And it was an introduction to philosophy for me. After I read it, I'd start doing practices like negative visualization, like self-denial. I'd be sleeping on the floor or eating a bowl of plain rice, just to kind of follow the things that this book was telling me. And it had quite profound effects on my life. It was the first time I kind of realized that the mind could unlock this happiness within you, this eternal happiness. There's a little reference to an Albert Camus quote. But it could unlock this eternal summer within me, just by having these different mental tricks that I could use to kind of fashioned my mind in the ways that I wanted it to. Then next in that vein was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is just a fantastic book to read, primarily because it's just interesting. I mean, it's very interesting to have a first-person account from a Roman emperor of what Rome was like, just from the historical kind of interest in me. But also, it is a deeply philosophical book. It teaches about the various thoughts that he had, which essentially now we know as Stoicism. So a very interesting book to read. Then next we have some more modern self-improvement books, and I like a few of these, but I'll be honest, a lot of them they're not fantastic. Anyway, we have the first one is The Way of the Superior Man, and I would recommend this book, but it depends. A lot of these books, I'll put it this way, if you can get them for free, great, read them, but I wouldn't go out and spend the amount of money that people charge for these things. So The Way of the Superior Man is an interesting book. It basically teaches about love and about how you should approach your life with love and with passion. Then we have Ikigai by Hector Garcia and Francesc Miralles, which is a book about these places called blue zones in the world, which are the areas of the world where people live the longest. And the common theme that they found was that a lot of them had this thing called an Ikigai, or a purpose in life. And it essentially teaches you how to find that purpose, what questions to ask yourself about that purpose. But again, it's quite a simplistic book at its root. It boils down to one thing, which we've even made videos on before. So I don't know if actually reading the entire book is going to get you that much, but maybe it will, who knows. Then next, number 16, we have The Magic of Thinking Big by David Schwartz. This is a book about ambition. It's a book about you're never going to achieve great things if you don't even believe that you want great things in the first place in a way. It's a book about having ambition. Atomic Habits by James Clear, everyone's heard about that. It's about the little habits that you can start in your life that have profound impacts when they all add together. The next, number 18, is The Great Rat Race Escape by MJ DeMarco. It's a book about basically why you should start a business. It's a book about why you should escape the rat race, why you can't live in it, and why you should start a business, how to do that. It's quite a practical book. It's a good read. It is. I have gained from it, but it's alright. The next is Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, who, if you know him, he's an ex-Navy SEAL, an ultramarathon runner. Basically, it's a book about how to build mental resilience and toughness, so it is a good read. It's quite an inspiring book to read. Then next is The Manual of the Warrior of Light by Paulo Coelho, and it's an alright read. It's basically like a selection of quotes about how to become this warrior of the light. It's quite a spiritual book. It's alright, so Paulo Coelho is the guy who wrote The Alchemist, things like that. If you know about The Alchemist, you know some of the criticisms people have about Paulo Coelho's writing, and they follow through into this book, but it's a more simplistic and digestible way to read it. It's a book that you can kind of open up once a day, flick to a random page, read it, gain something from it, close it, put it away again. That's how I would treat this book. Next we have The Second Mountain by David Brooks, and it's a book about why you should give, basically. So it has these idea of the two mountains. The first mountain is overcoming your egotistical goals, achieving monetary success, fame, whatever. Then the second mountain, it posits as the more important summit that people should surpass. And it's the idea of service, the idea of commitment to various things like family, like relationships, like community, and why that is an important thing to do. The next we have number 22, which is The Wim Hof Method by Wim Hof. And it's a book that I believe that everyone should gain the message from, but not everyone should necessarily read. Because, like I say, you can gain so much of it from, say, a video on cold showers. And we made that video if you want to go and watch it. A video on cold exposure can basically tell you everything you need to know about the Wim Hof method, but it's a nice book to read if you want to further ingrain that understanding. But it's a book about cold exposure and Wim Hof breathing. So that's the kind of self-improvement section of the books that I've read and would recommend. Then we move on to number 23, 24 and 25, which is the first of the self-improvement/philosophy section, sorry, the last. And those are books on politics. So if you're interested in politics, the books that I would recommend, at least the ones that I've read, are The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, which is about communism, very self-explanatory, On Anarchism by Noam Chomsky, which is about anarchism, very self-explanatory, and Manufacturing Consent, again by Noam Chomsky, which is about the idea of how like the media is controlled by a certain few people. So anyway, that's that section. And I'm going to do a little top 3 for each section. So the top 3 for self-improvement/philosophy I've called Meditations, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and The Outsider. They're the 3 I would recommend people to read if they want to get into philosophy and deeper reading. They're 3 fantastic books. And then next we move on to fiction. So it's the second section, and a lot of people are going to tune out here, but please don't. I think a big mistake a lot of people make on the kind of self-improvement sphere is that they disregard fiction as an aspect of reading, but really it's such an important part. These books here that I'm going to tell you about now had way bigger of an impact than anything in the self-improvement section that we just spoke about. Books like Ikigai or The Way of the Superior Man have nothing on these fiction books that we're going to speak about in a way that they'll change your life. And the first books are very much so like, so number 26 and 27 so number 26 is Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse. Remember we spoke about him before with Siddhartha. And it was the first book that ever taught me that fiction could be in itself a deeply philosophical and meaningful read. It was the first book that taught me that you could actually gain lessons and value from reading fiction, because before that I was like a lot of you guys maybe are now, who thought that really only self-improvement books could ever give me anything. But I read Steppenwolf, and it's a book essentially about a man who's disillusioned with life. And it spoke to me because at that time I was feeling that same disillusion. I was looking round at this modern society, at this modern world, and I was thinking, I don't know if I really like this. And it was a slap in the face to me, because it basically teaches you how to not feel those things. The end of the book is quite a psychedelic read, and not to spoil anything, but he speaks to Mozart, he speaks to these random, like, ancient musicians and artists and philosophers, and they slap him in the face and they say, stop being such a disillusioned twat. But it's a great book to read. Then second in that vein was The Wild Ass's Skin by Balzac. And it's essentially, it's an old school, like, it's like quite an old school book. I think it was even 1800s it was written in. But it's a book about this ass's skin, so a donkey's skin. And every time this guy makes a wish, the skin shrinks slightly. And when it disappears completely, he dies, is the premise of the book. And at the beginning he makes all these wishes, and it has beautiful descriptions of like kind of disgusting detail of like scenes of gambling and brothels and whatever, and then it moves into nature, and it's a book about the comparison, the dichotomy between the natural world and the human world that we live in. A beautiful book, a fantastic read. The number 28 is Waiting for Godot. And this is a play, but it's a very interesting read. So a good thing about reading a play is you can read it in about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. I'd say read it all in one go, just set aside 3 hours of your day. Or watch it, I'm sure you can find adaptations of it on YouTube, things like that. But it's a great play. Initially a lot of the reviews when it first came out were confused by it. It's by Samuel Beckett, by the way. They thought this play is crazy, nothing happens in it, but essentially it is a play like that. And it was the first insight into this idea of romanticization that literature can do, that good literature can do. That you can take essentially a boring scene where nothing happens in it, and from it you can discern the fact that your life is beautiful just by the very existence of it. If you can take a play where nothing happens and you can sit aside and watch it from afar and romanticize it, you can start to do the same thing with your life. You can start to see that there is beauty even in complete and utter mundanity. And I think that was the point of this book. It was a book about people waiting for what? For God, for whatever, for Godot. Who knows? There's a funny quote on the back of the book, at least the copy I've got. It was like Samuel Beckett said, if I wanted it to be about God, I would have called it Waiting for God. But I think you can have an interpretation of your book without letting the author tell you what to interpret from it. I would interpret it as people waiting for God. But anyway, next, number 29, we have Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, which is an absolute classic in this kind of like fictional, philosophical vein of reading. And it's a book about a guy who turns into a giant beetle. But really what it's about is acceptance and feeling estranged from society. So it's a fantastic read as well. Then number 30, we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Interesting book. It's a very good read. It's a good fiction book. It's essentially about a guy called Frankenstein who creates a monster, and this monster terrorizes town. It's about the guilt of creation, and it's quite a profound book in a way that it's like God who's created this beast and seeing what the beast is doing to the world and who's responsible for that, and do you have a responsibility over the things that you create and giving them happiness and whatever. It's a fantastic read. Then number 31, we have Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Sorry about that. It's a peculiar one to read because on the one hand I did find it incredibly boring at the time of reading it, but also it's it is a good book to read. It gives you an insight into the mind of a criminal and these ideas and feelings of guilt and why you do certain things. And it's good, but at the end of the day, it's a 700-page book, a Russian book at that. And people find it very boring. And then if you can compare it to something like book number 32, which is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, you can take a book that's 1,200 pages long, but every single page is riveting. That is the book I'd recommend as the best story I've ever read. Every page of it evokes emotion. Every character is so well developed. The entire book is intertwined, and you'll read something on page 1 and then page 600 will come along and it will call back to that initial thing that you didn't even realise was going to play a bigger part in the book. It is a fantastic experiment, or not experiment, but demonstration of what a real story can be. Then number 33, we have another deeply philosophical book by a slept-on author, and that's Zorba the Greek by Nikos Kazantzakis, who's a Greek author, so I'm Greek if you didn't know. But it's a fantastic book. It's a book deeply about philosophy, about this character Zorba, who might be one of the best characters ever written, who speaks about the real way to live a life with passion, with energy, without constantly thinking and conceptualizing various things. It's a book about seizing life by the fucking nuts and living it. It's such an inspirational read, and one of the books I always come back to when I'm feeling in a sort of rut. Then next we have 2 books by Harold Pinter, who was a Nobel Prize winning playwright. And they're The Caretaker and The Birthday Party. Again, I wouldn't necessarily say that these are my favourite plays, but they introduced me into what a play could be, into this kind of, I forget exactly what it's called, but a disillusioned style of playwriting. An absurd, there we go. It's called absurdist plays. So, like we spoke about before, Waiting for Godot is an example of an absurdist play. But these books taught me about absurdism. There might be another one later on about that, but anyway. Next we have The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it's a classic. It's just one of those books that you should read just because of the beauty of the book. It is a philosophical and profound book as well in its own kind of way, but I would read it purely because of the artistry behind the writing. I definitely recommend it. And then we have Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. Again, it's a good book. It's an interesting book and quite a confusing book about this guy who's going off to alien places but also is in the Dresden bombings in World War II, and it mashes things together and is a bit crazy but also a fantastic read. The next we have another classic that I would definitely recommend everyone to read, and that's 1984 by George Orwell. It's just one of those fiction books that really you have to read, especially if you're a young man. It's about disillusionment, about a world inside of a dystopian society. It's fantastic. Then we have number 39. Again, I'm glossing over a lot of these books because there's not much I can say other than just read them, they're great. Now we have The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, which is one of those books that often they tell young people to read. So if you're under about the age of 18, go and read it. If you're older, sure, you can gain from it as well, but if you're under that age, it's a book that will speak to you. It's a book about disillusionment with age and growing up and fear of kind of maturity. He has this phrase that he calls everyone a phony when he looks at his parents and the fucking prostitutes and whatever. He calls them all phonies, and it's a book about phonyism. Next, number 40, we have Anthony Burgess, A Clockwork Orange, which is a good book. It's an interesting book to read. It's written in slang, and the language is quite hard. In a way, you have to decode it yourself, and you get to about page 20 or 30, and you finally start to understand what's happening, and you're like, wow, this is actually kind of fucking cool. It's a book about stories, but also about guilt and kind of hedonism and pleasure and why people commit certain crimes, and then it's got a whole dystopian sphere of everything. I'm sure you've seen the movie or maybe the posters for it where there's that eye that's been forced wide open, and if you read it, it's a deeply dystopian book. And here we go, number 41. So this is another kind of absurdist play. It's called Rhinoceros by Eugene Ionesco. Fantastic play. Again, it's a book where basically everyone turns into a rhino except for this one guy, and it's a deeply philosophical and profound book as well about acceptance, kind of in the same vein that Metamorphosis was, about how you can look at everyone else and you can see kind of the descent into craze. But by the end of it, when everyone else is this rhino, but you're the only human, in fact, you're the one that feels weird. It was a parable for Nazism. It was written in France during the time of, I think maybe just after the Second World War, and it was about how a plague like that can transform and take over a society or a country. Fantastic. Then next we have Brighton Rock by Graham Greene, which is it's a story. I mean, every story has elements to it, but I'm going to say some books, when I say it's a story, I don't mean there are philosophical and profound elements to any book, but it is a book more about the plot. And it's essentially a book about gangsters in Brighton. It's a good book to read, though. Then next we have Brideheads Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, and I don't really know why it's on the list, but it's a good book. If you've watched Saltburn in the cinema, it's very similar to that. In fact, Saltburn is pretty much a rip-off of this book, but it's a good book to read. Then next we have The Plague by Albert Camus. Again, it's another book by Camus. It's written in a very similar, detached, absurdist style about a plague that rips through an Algerian town and various philosophical points on death and plagues. A nice book to read. I read it during the start of COVID and I was like, yeah, this seems fitting. Anyway, number 45 we have Lolita by Nabokov. And it's a book about a paedophile who falls in love with a child. But it's a very interesting book on a psychological level to gain insight into the world of something that is so demonized and criminalized. And it's in no way a defense of paedophilia, of course, but it's an understanding of it, a deeper understanding than you could ever gain from watching a news article or hearing about these things. Then number 46 we have another George Orwell book, and that's Down and Out in Paris and London. It's a book not many people hear about in regards to Orwell. I mean, you know him for Animal Farm in 1984, things like that, but Down and Out in Paris and London is an autobiographical book about him being essentially a homeless man travelling through Paris and travelling through London. It's just a great biographical read. Quite a nice historical book to read about an insight into a time that we don't understand. It's very nice to read these kind of first-person accounts of times that we've essentially read from history. Now we move on to a more complex book, and that's Catch-22 by Heller. I've forgotten his first name, I should have written that in my notes, but anyway, by Heller. And it's a classic, it's an absolute classic. You'll all have heard it, like, oh, that's a Catch-22. It's about this idea of, it's about these soldiers who go crazy, but they want to quit the army, but they can't quit the army, and it's a catch-22 because you have to prove that you're crazy to quit, but if you're proving that you're crazy, you're not allowed to quit. All these crazy things, but it's a fantastic book to read. Then next we have another book by another slept-on Greek author, and that's Red Dyed Hair by Moursellas. And it's a book similar to one I'm going to go on and talk about later, which is On the Road by Jack Kerouac, but it's basically the Greekified version of that. It's about this character who has an obsession with this man called Louis, and the way that he lives his life in such a passionate, alive way. It's a beautiful book on humanity, on character, on how to live a life. A fantastic book to read. Next we have another Herman Hesse book. It's called The Glass Bead Game. It's essentially about university and about institutionalized education and the downsides and upsides of that. It follows this man who's kind of a teacher and rises to the top ranks of his university. It's a book on education and educational hierarchy. It follows this game called the Glass Bead Game, which is a deeply profound and philosophical game where they try and combine all of human knowledge into one pursuit. It's a beautiful book to read. And next we have The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe, and I don't really remember this book fully actually, but I just remember I read it and it was pretty good. Next we have another play, Arthur Miller's The Crucible, a very famous play. It's about the Salem witch trials. But again, more deeply, it's about this kind of McCarthyism and about people being told why they hate each other before actually believing that hatred themselves. It's about this idea of condemning people for their existence rather than any reason. Anyway, great book to read. Then next we have The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Another great book for its plot. It's about a guy who travels deep into the Congo and meets this estranged kind of old person who travelled into the Congo before him and had gone a bit crazy. Anyway, next we have number 53, which is another book by Kazantzakis, who wrote the Zod about the Greek. It's Report to Greco. It's an autobiography about him when he was a kid and he travelled around Europe and around the rest of the world and learnt philosophy and travelled around Greece and went to Mount Athos, which is the monastic quarters of Greece, and he just learnt all of these things. Great book. Number 54 we have Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. Strange name, but anyway, Fight Club, if you've watched the film, you'll know exactly what it is. Very interesting when you read the book. It's almost a word-for-word script, almost, of the film, because if you know a bit about the history of it, Chuck Palahniuk wrote the book intending it to become a film. He wrote it in a way because he wanted it to be dramatised on the screen. And so the book very much so reads like a film would. And it's a great read. If you like the film, you'll love the book. It's similar, it's just more in depth as most books are. Then finally number 55, sorry not finally, but number 55 we have To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. A great plot again about a court trial, about racism. A classic that people should read. And then finally The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, which is again, it's another one of those books where not really much happens, but it's beautiful because it romanticizes the world. And it's a book about a guy who sails out to sea and catches a fish and has this battle with this great fish. Totally random, but a brilliant book just because of its message about what life really is. It's another absurdist book in the same way that Camus is. So the top three from that section, we have Zorba the Greek, Steppenwolf and A Clockwork Orange are the three I'd recommend you to read, each for very different reasons. I mean, Zorba the Greek is a great account of this character who lives life to the fullest. Steppenwolf is a beautiful book on philosophy and disillusion, and then A Clockwork Orange is just a great plot, a dystopian fiction novel. If you're into dystopian sci-fi, whatever, it's fantastic to read. Now that we move on to the first literary phase that I had in my life, now is the discovery of Haruki Murakami, a Japanese author. And very much so, the books that he wrote speak in the same way to me as things like Waiting for Godot did. They're books where they're beautifully written, beautifully described, and they describe life in such a way that you can kind of step out and look at your life after you've read them and think that they're beautiful. They're books that pervade your existence. They're sad and tragic and wistful, and they have this kind of character that appears throughout all of them, this man who drinks whiskey and loves listening to records, and it's great, especially maybe if you're a woman it's hard to maybe relate to it as much, but they're still fantastic books and fantastic reads. They're beautiful. So the first one, and we're going to rattle through them because it's more about the point of reading them than it is the books themselves, but he mixes dystopian themes with kind of surrealist aspects, and he travels through dreams and different worlds and different things. It's fantastic. It's just a beautiful introduction into a fiction that maybe you didn't even know was possible. It's similar with a lot of Japanese fiction. You have other writers like Ishiguro and whatever. And Japanese fiction often is very surrealist in this way. So first though, you have a not very surrealist book. Though. You have Norwegian Wood, which is a wistful tale of love and suicide and... spoiler. But yeah, you have this kind of tale of... well, it's not really a spoiler, it happens within the first like 30 pages, but it's a book about love and about sadness, but also just a romantic portrayal of life. And it lets you step outside and look at your own life and think, yeah, nothing much happens, but it's beautiful just in itself. Sitting here with the wind blowing outside, listening to this beautiful record of music, fucking Vivaldi's Winter, listening to that, and just everything unites in a perfect beauty. And that's what the book teaches you. It teaches you to appreciate your own life in quite an external way. It's a fantastic read. Then next we have The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which is another classic by him, and it's a very much more kind of surreal book. It's one of his more surreal books, and again it introduces you into this kind of surreality, if that's even a word. Then next we have 1Q84, which is his opus mater, or whatever the word is, opus, magnum opus. It's like a 2,000 page book split into 3 different books where he follows these 3 characters as they go throughout the rest of the world. I wouldn't start with this book, I'd read his other books first, and then if you like his style, I'd read 1Q84 because it's just a way longer version of his other books, which if you start getting into it, that's exactly what you'll crave. Anyway, next we have A Wild Sheep Chase, which as it sounds is a book about a guy chasing a sheep around Japan. It's as surreal as it sounds, it's totally crazy, and then that has a sequel called Dance, 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 which again I would totally recommend. A pair of fantastic books to read. Number 62 we have Kafka on the Shore, which is a book about this boy who leaves home, he runs away and he meets this woman and various things happen. Then next we have Killing Commendator, which is about a man who finds a painting, I think, in his basement, and the painting starts to come to life and speaks to him. Again, deeply surreal. And then finally, to end it off, we have a book that again detaches from that surreality. It's not surreal anymore. It's again another beautiful portrayal of life and love, and that's South of the Border, West of the Sun. It's a simple but beautiful book, a very short book, maybe 100, 150 pages long. Just a beautiful account of living. It's one of his earlier books. It's maybe not one I'd recommend to start off with, but once you get a feel for his writing style, you might appreciate it. The top three I'd recommend from Murakami are Norwegian Wood, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, and Wild Sheep Chase. They're books you should definitely. And then finally we have the biggest literary phase in my life, and the phase that just changed my life in the most profound and deep way. It taught me so much. It taught me the beauty of art. It taught me the beauty of poetry and writing and experiencing life to the fullest. It's a section about youth and vibrance and this artistic style written in a Renaissance period in San Francisco. It was these authors who came together called the Beat Generation in about the 1950s of America, just after the Second World War, when things were starting to boom and consumerism was at its peak, and you had this group of individuals who were so devoid of any feeling, because when you reach that peak of consumerism, you're left with a mirror that stares into you and says, well, what is really the meaning of this life? And they tried to answer that question through hedonism, through drugs, through spirituality, through Buddhism, through living life to the fullest. And you have various books that came out of that philosophical movement. The first one, of course, famous, is On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And it's a book about two characters who run back and forward across America searching for life's meaning, searching for it. Fantastic. It's the book that shaped my life, that changed my life in the most profound and meaningful way. The book that is why I am here now in Australia. The book that made me travel across the world. The book that influenced almost every single life decision I have made up until this point. The book that makes you want to live life, that makes you want to chase that youthful spirit, that makes you want to experience everything this beautiful world has to offer. And it's written in such a deeply moving way. Fantastic. And that is the book I would recommend more than anything else on this list if you're a young man or woman who maybe feels a bit disillusioned with the way that the world is going. But Kerouac is fantastic, and we have another, a few more books by Kerouac that I'm going to recommend, because I've read almost every one of his and I fucking love them. Next we have Big Sur by Kerouac, which is again, it's more a book for the artistry of a book. He writes it, it's about a beach called Big Sur, which is a famous place in California, and he writes about it. Anyway, next we have The Dharma Bums, which is... See, Kerouac was a misunderstood writer. Everyone reads On the Road and they think that all he is a guy that ran around America doing drugs, having sex, cheating on women, being sexist and misogynistic and racist, which, granted, On the Road is a lot of those things. But The Dharma Bums, I think, is a more natural and true adaptation, or not adaptation, but portrayal of what Kerouac is. And it's about deep spirituality. It's about Buddhism, the Dharma, of course, being the teachings of the Buddha. It has, again, some of the best characters ever written. Gary Snyder or Jaffe Ryder in the book. So another great thing about all of Kerouac's books is they're deeply autobiographical. So this book tells the story of Gary Snyder, who is an anarcho-primitivist writer. Again, it's great just to be able to read the books that they write, but he climbs up mountains and meditates, and it's fucking beautiful. Again, it's another, I can't recommend it enough. If you're disillusioned with life at all, then again, fantastic. Next, number 68, we have Desolation Angels, which is a book about a period Jack Kerouac spent, at the top of a mountain as a fire watch. It's a book about the philosophy of solitude and loneliness and looking out into this vast expanse of land in front of you and seeing and feeling God, and then the move back towards the city and the kind of how you can balance deep philosophy with also, just drugs and music and sex and all the things that the city brings is fantastic. And then you have Visions of Cody, number 69, which is a very interesting book. If you read On the Road, so there's these two characters, who's Neil Cassidy is the real life character and Jack Kerouac. And Visions of Cody is essentially Kerouac recorded conversations that they had with Cody, who's Neil Cassidy. They speak and they just talk and they spend hours just talking, just chatting fucking shit, basically, high on drugs. And it's a very interesting book to read. Then the final two you have are maybe books I wouldn't recommend necessarily, but they're The Subterraneans by Jack Kerouac and The Town and the City. And they're quite just books. The Town and the City is about his early life, and Subterraneans is a very short 150-page book about life in a city. But reading those spawned a wider kind of interest in these beat authors. And then we have Requiem for a Dream and The Last Exit to Brooklyn, both by Hubert Selby Jr. Very funny story he had. So he was a Navy officer, I think, or like a private maybe. And then he decided one day, I know the alphabet, I'm going to start writing books. And he went and he wrote Requiem for a Dream, The Last Exit to Brooklyn, which are deeply disgusting books about how horrible and gruesome capitalism can be, about how horrible society can be. They're books about ugliness, about drugs and death and paedophilia and prostitution and just the most disgusting things, but in a way a very beautiful read and an insight into the world that we live in. Then you have another author who was fantastic and big in this field. It's Charles Bukowski, who wrote The Post Office and Ham on Rye and Tales of Ordinary Madness. And he was an author who famously said, "Don't try." That was his deep philosophical point. And a lot of the books are like that. They're books about, again, the ugliness of the world. And this character, Henry Chinaski, who kind of hates life and how he moves through this life just working these boring menial jobs as a post office worker or whatever, and what the world is. It's a brilliant just depiction of that. Then next you have Naked Lunch and Junkie by William S. Burroughs, who's an old writer who spent most of his time high on heroin and wrote these books like Naked Lunch, which are totally crazy and surreal when nothing really happens. You don't know what is happening. They're a combination and a collection of different mini stories that all link together into one big thing, but again, they're totally surreal. They occur in fictitious places and sci-fi worlds and crazy. And then finally, number 79, you have a poem. You have Howl by Allen Ginsberg, which is a depiction of the Beat Generation in itself. It's a beautiful, poetic journey about the world and society. And it takes half an hour to read, so I'd say go and read it after this. You can find it for free on the Poetry Foundation. Go and read Howl by Allen Ginsberg. And the top three of that section was the Dharma Bums, Requiem for a Dream, and On the Road are the three I'd say. But my top five generally, what are the top five books I'd recommend to you to read from this list? And there's no specific order, but number one is Zorba the Greek. Again, a book on why or how to live life. On the Road, again, a book on how to live. Meditations, a book on how to live. Norwegian Wood, a book on the beauty of life. And finally, Thus Spake Zarathustra, a deep philosophical poem. And that is the end of that video. So if you gained any value from it, drop a subscribe. Come and give me a call or join the Discord if you want to have a chat about more of these things. And I'm proud of you, brother. Manifest excellence. I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.